April 12, 1945, 2:17 p.m. Inside Hut 104, North Compound, Stalag Luft III, Lower Silesia. Lieutenant Thomas Whitaker pressed the worn Bakelite headphone tighter against his ear, the metal cold despite the afternoon warmth creeping through the barracks walls. Static hissed and crackled through the hidden crystal receiver, a device no larger than a cigarette pack, built from stolen wire, salvaged capacitors pulled from German work lights, and a coil wound by hand around a piece of wooden bedboard. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the copper antenna strand that ran invisibly along the roof beam, camouflaged with dust and grime accumulated over 18 months of operation. The smell of pine tar soap and unwashed wool filled the cramped space beneath the floorboards where he crouched, knees pressed against rough timber, the weight of secrecy pressing down like the earth above the tunnels they dug for the Great Escape 13 months before. Outside, the afternoon roll call had just concluded, 11,000 prisoners accounted for, German guards satisfied, another day of captivity confirmed. But Whitaker wasn't listening to the count. He was listening to London. The BBC transmission came through in waves, fighting through German jamming stations, each word a lifeline stretched across 800 miles of Nazi-occupied Europe. And then he heard it. 4 words that stopped his breathing. President Roosevelt is dead. If you found this story gripping, please subscribe to hear more untold stories from World War II that changed the course of history. The radio network at Stalag Luft III represented one of the most audacious intelligence operations conducted from behind barbed wire in the entire European theater. By April 1945, 5 separate receivers operated across the camp's compounds, north, south, east, west, and center. Each one a technical marvel assembled from contraband that would have earned its builders immediate execution if discovered. The Luftwaffe guards who ran Stalag Luft III, while generally more humane than their Wehrmacht or SS counterparts, had standing orders from Berlin regarding sabotage and espionage. Possession of a radio transmitter or receiver was classified as an act of warfare, punishable by death without trial. The Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war did not extend to those caught engaging in intelligence activities. Yet from 1943 onward, American and British airmen in Stalag Luft III had maintained continuous monitoring of Allied broadcasts, creating an underground news service that sustained hope when hope itself was a scarce commodity. The technology required to build a functioning radio receiver under these conditions would have impressed engineers in the free world. Howard Cundall, a specialist observer from Britain's telecommunications research establishment, had intimate knowledge of radar systems and electronic warfare. Captured in 1943 after his bomber went down over the Ruhr, Cundall arrived at Stalag Luft III with technical expertise the Luftwaffe never suspected. Within weeks, he had identified the components necessary to construct not just a receiver, but a transmitter capable of reaching Allied intelligence in London. The operation began with systematic theft. German electricians working on camp lighting systems left tools and wire unattended for only minutes. But minutes were sufficient. Prisoners on work details outside the wire collected capacitors from damaged vehicles, resistors from burned-out generators, any electronic component that could be pocketed and smuggled past the cursory searches at the gate. The camp's theater, built by prisoners with German approval and materials, provided perfect cover. Behind the stage, in a sealed compartment accessible only by removing 3 apparently fixed boards, Cundall established his workshop. There, using a soldering iron fashioned from a modified heating element and solder scraped from food tins, he assembled the first working receiver in September 1943. The antenna was genius in its simplicity, a length of copper wire stolen from German telephone lines, run along the interior roof beams of Hut 104, camouflaged to look like structural bracing. The radio itself, when not in use, was disassembled into components that appeared to be nothing more than scraps of metal and wood stored among the prisoners' personal effects. Security surrounding the radio operation was absolute. The Escape Committee, the same organization that had coordinated the Great Escape of March 1944, controlled all access to the receivers. Every German guard's movement within the compound was tracked by a system called Duty Pilot, where prisoners maintained constant surveillance and logged positions in a notebook disguised as a personal diary. Before any radio listening session, a network of lookouts established itself throughout the compound. A system of signals, a man cleaning his glasses, another tying his shoe, someone coughing twice, could shut down the entire operation in seconds if a guard approached unexpectedly. The Germans knew something was happening. They had to know. Information about Allied advances, specific details about battles and strategic movements, circulated among the prisoners with suspicious accuracy. But the Germans couldn't find the radios. They tore apart huts suspected of housing receivers, used metal detectors, brought in dogs trained to find electronic equipment. The prisoners stayed one step ahead, moving receivers between compounds, hiding them in new locations, sometimes burying them in the exercise yard inside waterproof containers made from salvaged rubber and sealed with tar. The psychological cat-and-mouse game became another form of combat, waged not with weapons but with cunning and desperation. By 1945, the radio network had evolved into a sophisticated intelligence operation. 3 separate receiver units operated simultaneously, each tuned to different frequencies to cross-reference information. Prisoners with shorthand skills transcribed broadcasts word for word, creating written bulletins that were circulated throughout the compound under the guise of theater programs or educational materials. The camp's library, stocked with Red Cross books and educational materials, contained hollowed-out volumes where transcripts were hidden between false pages. A prisoner could check out a book on agricultural engineering and find inside it yesterday's BBC broadcast, detailing Soviet advances in Poland. The information sustained more than hope. It sustained strategic resistance. When the Germans tried to coerce prisoners into working in factories or mines, which violated the Geneva Convention's prohibition on using officer prisoners for labor, the POWs could cite specific Allied advances as proof that Germany was losing. "We know about the bulge," they'd tell German officers. "We know you're retreating on all fronts. The war will be over in months. You want us to remember you forced us into illegal labor when your own troops are surrendering?" The radios gave them leverage, a currency of knowledge in a place where cigarettes and chocolate were the usual medium of exchange. The broadcast from London had tracked the war's progression like a slow tide rising to drown the Third Reich. In June 1944, the radios brought news of D-Day 18 hours before the Germans officially announced it to their own military. Prisoners listened to the BBC describe Allied forces landing on Normandy beaches, while German guards outside their huts still believed the Atlantic Wall was holding. In August 1944, they heard about the liberation of Paris. In December, they monitored reports of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive in the West, and listened as that offensive ground to a halt and then collapsed. In January 1945, they heard about Soviet forces crossing into Germany itself, driving toward Berlin. Each broadcast was a confirmation that the end was coming, that their captivity would not last forever, that the sacrifice of being shot down, of surviving crashes, of enduring the cold and hunger and tedium of prisoner of war existence had meaning. The radios transformed them from victims into witnesses. They weren't just enduring the war, they were tracking it, analyzing it, understanding it in real time with more accurate information than many German officers possessed. Some German guards, quietly anti-Nazi and certain of Germany's defeat, actually asked prisoners what the BBC was reporting. "What did London say about the Russians?" a young Luftwaffe sergeant would whisper to a prisoner he'd befriended. The information flowed both ways, building strange alliances across barbed wire between men who technically were enemies, but who shared a common understanding that the nightmare was ending. Lieutenant Thomas Whitaker had been operating the North Compound radio for 8 months when he heard the April 12th broadcast. A B-17 pilot from Ohio, shot down over Bremen in October 1943, Whitaker had survived 18 months in Stalag Luft III by maintaining a rigid discipline of hope. He'd helped dig Tunnel Harry for the Great Escape, had been number 189 on the list to escape, and therefore had remained behind when the tunnel was discovered after only 76 men had gotten out. He'd lost friends to the Gestapo executions that followed. 50 men murdered in reprisal, shot in small groups, and cremated. Their ashes returned to the camp in urns that sat in the chapel like accusations. For Whitaker and thousands of others, Roosevelt was more than a president. He was the embodiment of American power, the voice on the radio that promised them that their nation would never stop, never surrender, never accept anything less than total victory. Roosevelt's fireside chats had been broadcast into Stalag Luft III through the secret receivers, his words transcribed and circulated. "We shall not settle for less than total victory," Roosevelt had said. Those words had sustained men through winters when coal rations were cut, through summers when Red Cross parcels stopped arriving, through the days after the Great Escape when they didn't know who had died and who had escaped. Whitaker sat motionless beneath the floorboards, the headphones still pressed to his ears, as the BBC announcer continued with details. Cerebral hemorrhage, or cerebral hemorrhage. Warm Springs, Georgia. President had been sitting for a portrait when he collapsed. Dead within hours. Harry Truman sworn in as president. The words came through in the clipped British accent of the BBC announcer, professional and measured, as if reporting another battle statistic. But Whitaker understood the magnitude. This wasn't another battle. This was a fundamental shift in the war's leadership at the moment when final victory was within reach. Soviet forces were 15 miles from Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The Nazis were collapsing on all fronts. And now, at this critical moment, the man who had led America through depression and war was gone. Whitaker's mind raced through implications. Would Truman continue Roosevelt's policies? Would the alliance with Stalin hold? Would the promised commitment to unconditional surrender remain? For men locked behind wire in the heart of collapsing Nazi Germany, these weren't academic questions. They were survival calculations. If the alliance fractured, if the Western Allies made a separate peace with Germany to focus on Japan, the prisoners in Stalag Luft III could become bargaining chips, hostages, or simply forgotten casualties of political realignment. Whitaker pulled the headphones off and carefully began the shutdown procedure. The receiver was disassembled in a specific sequence, antenna disconnected first, then the tube removed, then the coil separated from the capacitor. Each component went into its designated hiding place. The antenna coil wrapped around a bed leg. The capacitor slipped inside a hollowed-out Red Cross dictionary. The tube went into a sock stuffed into a rolled-up mattress. Within 3 minutes, no evidence of the radio existed, but the knowledge of what he'd heard couldn't be hidden. He climbed out from under the floorboards, his knees stiff, and emerged into the main barracks area where 30 men waited in studied casual positions, some playing cards, others reading, all of them watching him. They'd known from his body language that something was wrong. Whitaker had been operating the radio long enough that the veterans could read him like a dial. "Roosevelt's dead," he said quietly. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. For perhaps 5 seconds, no one moved. Then Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison, senior American officer in the North Compound, stood up from the card game he'd been pretending to play. Harrison was 41 years old, a P-51 pilot who'd been shot down protecting bombers over Schweinfurt in 1943. He'd been in German captivity longer than he'd been in combat, and the months behind wire had carved lines into his face that made him look a decade older. "Say that again, Lieutenant," Harrison said, his voice carefully neutral. Whitaker repeated it, adding the details the BBC had provided. As he spoke, more men gathered. Word passed through the hut without anyone speaking above a conversational tone. The habit of secrecy so ingrained that even devastating news was communicated in near whispers. Within 10 minutes, everyone in Hut 104 knew. Within an hour, the entire North Compound knew. By evening roll call, all 5 compounds had received the news through the elaborate communication networks the prisoners had built over years of confinement. The German guards noticed the change immediately but couldn't understand its cause. The prisoners, who usually maintained a defiant cheerfulness, who sang songs during roll call, who made jokes and maintained morale through deliberate displays of spirit, were silent. Men stood at attention with tears running down their faces, making no effort to hide them. Others stared at the ground, their shoulders shaking. Some stood rigid, faces blank with shock. Major Gustav Simmelite, the deputy commandant and a professor of history before the war, walked along the ranks during the evening count and felt the atmosphere of grief so thick it was almost physical. Simmelite spoke English fluently and had developed relationships with several of the senior prisoners. He approached Colonel Harrison after the count. "Something has happened," Simmelite said. It wasn't a question. Harrison looked at the German officer for a long moment, calculating. The protection of the radio network was absolute. No information could be revealed that might help the Germans find it. But this news would be on German radio within hours anyway. There was no operational security reason to hide it. President Roosevelt died today, Harrison said quietly. Simulate's face registered genuine shock. Whatever he'd expected, news of a military disaster perhaps, or word of harsh treatment of German prisoners, this was something else entirely. I am sorry, Simulate said slowly. He'd fought against the Allies, had helped keep these men imprisoned, but he was a historian and understood what Roosevelt meant to the American project. This is a great loss for your country. Harrison nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. Simulate continued down the line, informing other German officers of what had happened. Within an hour, the German guards had changed their behavior, less strict with minor infractions, more careful not to provoke, aware that they were watching men in mourning. The night of April 12, 1945, was one of the strangest in Stalag Luft III's history. In the barracks, men who'd maintained iron discipline for years broke down. Captain James Mitchell, a bomber navigator from Georgia who'd been shot down over Hamburg, sat on his bunk and openly wept. Mitchell had heard Roosevelt speak in Atlanta in 1936, had shaken his hand at a political rally. He'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, had flown 32 missions over Germany before flak tore his plane apart at 20,000 feet. He'd survived bailout, capture, interrogation, and 18 months in this camp by holding on to the certainty that Roosevelt's America would win, would never quit, would bring him home. Now Roosevelt was gone, and Mitchell felt unmoored, adrift in a way that combat had never made him feel. Other men responded with anger. Lieutenant David Kowalski, a bombardier from Chicago, wanted to know why the news came now when victory was weeks away. Why couldn't he have held on, Kowalski demanded, to no one and everyone? We're so close. We're so goddamn close. Some men retreated into silence, processing the news internally, adding it to the accumulated weight of loss they'd been carrying. Death had been their constant companion, the deaths of crew members in the planes that went down, the deaths of fellow prisoners from disease or cold or German bullets during the Great Escape. Roosevelt's death was different because it felt like a betrayal of the inevitable. They'd believed, with the certainty of faith, that Roosevelt would be president when they were liberated, that he'd be there at the end to validate their sacrifice. Now that certainty was gone. Throughout the night in all 5 compounds, the secret radio network continued operating. Men took turns listening to broadcasts, gathering every detail of Roosevelt's death and Truman's succession. The BBC provided extensive coverage. American Forces network broadcasts were monitored. Even German radio was listened to. The Nazi broadcast painted Roosevelt as a warmonger and his death as divine justice, which made prisoners' blood boil, but also confirmed that the news was real, not some Allied disinformation. By morning roll call on April 13th, the prisoners of Stalag Luft III had more detailed information about the presidential transition than most German officers. They knew about Roosevelt's final moments at Warm Springs. They knew about Eleanor Roosevelt's statement. They knew about the special train carrying his body back to Washington. They knew about Truman's first address as president, his promise to continue Roosevelt's policies without deviation. The information helped, slightly. If Truman held the course, if the alliance remained intact, if unconditional surrender remained the goal, then perhaps Roosevelt's death wouldn't alter their fate. But the grief remained, complicated by the bizarre circumstances of mourning while imprisoned by the enemy in a collapsing nation. The radios had tracked not just Allied victory, but Allied disagreement. In February, the prisoners had listened to broadcasts about the Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had met to plan the post-war world. The transcripts circulated through the camp had sparked intense debates. What would happen to Germany after surrender? Would the country be divided? What about the prisoners? Would they be liberated by American, British, or Soviet forces? These weren't academic questions for men trapped 100 miles southeast of Berlin, directly in the path of the Soviet advance. Stories had circulated about Soviet treatment of German prisoners. Some German guards, terrified of Soviet capture, had quietly asked American prisoners if they could surrender to them instead when the time came. The strange inversion of power, German guards begging their prisoners for protection, had been darkly amusing. But Roosevelt's death added new uncertainty. Stalin had worked with Roosevelt for 4 years. He didn't know Truman. Would the Soviet leader view the presidential transition as an opportunity to push for more control in post-war Europe? If Soviet and American forces raced to capture territory, where did that leave prisoners caught in between? These strategic calculations occupied the senior officers, but for most prisoners, the grief was simpler and more personal. Roosevelt had been a constant in their lives. Many of the men in Stalag Luft III had grown up during the Depression, had been saved by New Deal programs, had listened to Roosevelt's fireside chats since they were children. He'd been president their entire adult lives. When they'd enlisted or been drafted, Roosevelt had been president. When they'd gone through flight training, Roosevelt had been president. When they'd shipped overseas, Roosevelt had been president. When they'd been shot down and captured, Roosevelt had been president. They'd assumed, with the unquestioned certainty that the young have about the permanence of their world, that Roosevelt would be president when they went home. Now that assumption lay shattered, and they had to reconstruct their sense of the future around its absence. The radio network, which had delivered the devastating news, now became the means of healing. Over the following days, the secret receivers monitored every detail of the national mourning. Prisoners listened to Roosevelt's funeral train's journey from Warm Springs to Washington. They heard about the crowds that lined the tracks, sometimes 20 or 30 people deep, standing in silence as the train passed. They heard about the funeral service at the White House, about Roosevelt's burial at Hyde Park. The BBC provided extensive coverage, and American Forces Network broadcast special programming. Men gathered in small groups to listen to these broadcasts, creating their own memorial services in barracks designed to hold prisoners, but which now functioned as churches. Some men spoke about what Roosevelt meant to them. Others stayed silent. Chaplains, prisoners themselves, led prayers. In the North Compound, Captain William Thornton, a Baptist minister from Tennessee who'd flown bombers before being shot down, organized a memorial service on April 15th. 300 men attended, gathering in the athletic field under the watch of German guards who'd been informed of the event and chose not to interfere. Thornton spoke about faith in uncertain times, about continuing the mission even when leaders fall, about the obligation to finish what others started. His words were directed at mourning Roosevelt, but everyone understood the broader message. They had to keep going, had to survive, had to make it through these final weeks of the war so that Roosevelt's vision of victory would be realized. The German guards' reactions to Roosevelt's death varied widely and revealed the fractures within German military society by April 1945. Some guards, hardcore Nazis who still believed in ultimate victory despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, celebrated openly. Prisoners watched these guards with cold calculation, memorizing faces, planning to report them if the Geneva Convention provisions against prisoner abuse were ever enforced. Other guards, the majority, seemed troubled by the news. They'd fought a brutal war against enemies they'd been taught to hate, but Roosevelt's death at the moment of Allied victory felt somehow tragic even to them. A few guards approached prisoners they'd developed relationships with and offered quiet condolences, awkward expressions of shared humanity across the divide of war. One young Luftwaffe corporal, a boy of 19 who'd been sent to guard duty after being wounded on the Eastern Front, told an American prisoner he was sorry. "I think maybe the war ends better with him," the corporal said in broken English. "Maybe less revenge if he lives." The prisoner, Captain Terence Morgan, found himself touched by the sentiment. This German teenager who'd watched his country collapse, who'd seen horrors on the Russian front, who'd lost friends and family to Allied bombing, could still recognize the potential for a better peace under different leadership. Morgan reported the conversation during that evening's briefing with senior officers, and it circulated through the camp as evidence that not all Germans were fanatics, that reconstruction after the war might be possible if men of good faith survived on both sides. The strategic implications of Roosevelt's death, which had so worried the prisoners initially, became clearer as the radio network monitored Allied reactions over the following week. Truman's statements were decisive and unambiguous. No change in policy, continued alliance with the Soviet Union and Britain, unconditional surrender remained the goal, maximum pressure on all fronts until Germany capitulated. Churchill's broadcast message praising Roosevelt and pledging continued coordination with Truman was transcribed and circulated. Most importantly, monitoring of Soviet broadcasts showed Stalin publicly affirming the alliance and his partnership with the new American president. For the prisoners, this was enormous relief. The alliance would hold. The war would end as planned. They would be liberated, not forgotten. The radio network, which had sustained them through years of captivity, had now guided them through perhaps their darkest moment of uncertainty. But the radios also brought increasingly urgent tactical information. By late April 1945, broadcasts made clear that Soviet forces were advancing rapidly towards Stalag Luft III's location. German broadcasts admitted Soviet troops had reached the Oder River, only 60 miles away. American and British broadcasts discussed the race between Soviet and Western Allied forces to capture key German cities. The prisoners understood what this meant. Liberation was imminent, but it would almost certainly come from Soviet forces, not American or British. This created complex emotions. They wanted freedom desperately, but the unknown of Soviet liberation worried men who'd been fed anti-Soviet propaganda before capture and had heard stories during their imprisonment. The senior officers used the radio network to monitor Soviet advances and plan for the moment of liberation, developing protocols for how to interact with Soviet troops, how to identify themselves as Allied POWs, how to prevent any tragic mistakes in the confusion of the Third Reich's final collapse. The liberation never came. On January 27, 1945, weeks before Roosevelt's death, Stalag Luft III had been evacuated as Soviet forces approached within 16 miles. 11,000 prisoners had been forced marched westward through winter storms, a brutal journey that killed some and scattered others. The radio network had been maintained during the march. Cundall himself had carried a concealed receiver wrapped in waterproof cloth, maintaining contact with London even during the forced relocation. The prisoners were eventually distributed among other camps deeper in Germany. Stalag 7A at Moosburg, Stalag 13 DM at Nuremberg, other facilities where they waited for liberation that came in late April from American forces pushing eastward. The secret radios that had sustained them through years at Stalag Luft III continued operating until the final days, until American tanks rolled up to the camp gates and the need for secrecy ended. The final radio transmission received by the former prisoners of Stalag Luft III before their liberation was a BBC broadcast on April 28, 1945. Hitler was reported to be in Berlin, surrounded by Soviet forces. The end was days away, hours perhaps. Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans and executed. The Nazi regime was disintegrating. The prisoners, by then liberated from Stalag 17A by the American 14th Armored Division, listened to this broadcast as free men for the first time in years. Some wept, others cheered. Most simply stood silent, trying to process the reality that their captivity was over, that they'd survived, that the radios which had sustained their hope through the darkest years had accurately reported the war's course from the first days to the last. Lieutenant Thomas Whitaker, who'd heard the news of Roosevelt's death through hidden headphones beneath the floorboards of Hut 104, was liberated from Stalag Luft III on April 29th. When American soldiers opened the gates, Whitaker walked out carrying nothing except the crystal radio receiver he'd operated for months, disassembled and hidden in his pockets. He refused to leave it behind. The device had been his connection to home, his proof that America was winning, his assurance during Roosevelt's death that the mission would continue. 3 months later, back in Ohio, Whitaker would display the radio components on his dining room table and explain to his family what they meant, how this collection of stolen wire and salvaged parts had kept hundreds of men alive by keeping hope alive. His mother would hold the tiny crystal receiver, no bigger than a cigarette pack, and cry, not from sorrow but from wonder that something so small could have meant so much. The secret radios of Stalag Luft III became legendary within the POW community after the war. Veterans reunions featured displays of similar devices built in other camps, each one a testament to ingenuity under pressure. Howard Cundall, the British telecommunications specialist who designed the first Stalag Luft III receiver, was decorated for his intelligence work. His radio had provided information to Allied forces about German night defenses, about Luftwaffe dispositions, about strategic installations near the camp. The transmitter he'd built had maintained contact with London through 1944 and 1945, turning a prisoner of war camp into an active intelligence asset. The value of this information was classified for decades, but British intelligence estimates suggested that Cundall's reports had saved dozens of bomber crews by alerting them to changes in German air defense tactics. The radio operations at Stalag Luft III had involved over 600 prisoners in various capacities, building components, providing security, distributing information, maintaining secrecy. Not a single German guard ever found the radios during operational periods. Some receivers were discovered after prisoners evacuated or after the war ended, but during active operations, the security was absolute. This represented organizational discipline and operational security that rivaled professional intelligence services. The psychological impact of the radios exceeded their intelligence value. Prisoners who maintained hope had higher survival rates. Medical officers in the camps documented this extensively. Men who believed liberation was coming, who had concrete evidence of Allied progress, who felt connected to the outside world, resisted disease better, maintained body weight more effectively, and showed lower rates of psychological breakdown. The radios provided that evidence and that connection. Every broadcast from London was proof that they hadn't been forgotten, that the war was progressing, that their sacrifice mattered. When Roosevelt died and the radios brought that news, the same network that delivered the blow immediately began delivering the cure. Information about continuity, about Truman's competence, about the alliance holding firm. The prisoners processed their grief in real time alongside their free countrymen because the radios made that possible. The story of Roosevelt's death reaching Stalag Luft III through secret radios built from scraps represents something profound about American character during World War II. The refusal to accept limitations, the application of technical skill to impossible problems, the maintenance of hope through action. These men could have simply endured their captivity passively, waiting for liberation without knowing when or if it would come. Instead, they built intelligence networks. They constructed radios from stolen components. They maintained contact with home through devices that violated every camp regulation and risked execution if discovered. They transformed themselves from prisoners into participants, monitoring the war that continued beyond their barbed wire, analyzing strategies, understanding the larger mission of which they'd been part before capture and remained part of despite confinement. When Roosevelt's death reached them on April 12, 1945, the news traveled through a network that represented years of effort, risk, and determination. The same qualities that had made them airmen, technical skill, courage, commitment to mission, had made them radio operators and intelligence gatherers behind wire. Roosevelt's death tested their resolve at the moment when liberation was closest, when giving up would have been most tragic. They processed their grief through the same radios that had brought the news, and those radios told them what they needed to hear, that the mission continued, that Truman would carry forward Roosevelt's vision, that they would be liberated as planned. 3 weeks after hearing of Roosevelt's death, they were free. The radios had sustained them through the final darkest moment, and the radio's promise of liberation had proven true. The legacy of the Stalag Luft III radios extended far beyond the camp's liberation. After the war, veterans of the radio operations contributed to civilian communications development, applying skills learned in desperate circumstances to peacetime innovation. The techniques for hiding equipment, for maintaining operational security, for constructing devices from minimal components, all of these found applications in Cold War intelligence operations. Former prisoners of war became engineers, teachers, businessmen, carrying with them the knowledge that impossible problems have solutions if approached with sufficient creativity and will. Some continued in military intelligence, their prisoner experience giving them unique insight into resistance operations. Others simply returned to civilian life, rarely speaking about the radios but carrying forever the memory of lying beneath floorboards, headphones pressed to ears, listening to the BBC announce that Roosevelt was dead, and understanding that even in that moment of grief, they were not alone, they were not forgotten, they were connected to home by wires and willpower. The secret radios that told the prisoners of Stalag Luft III about Roosevelt's death did not just deliver news. They delivered connection, proof of civilization's continuity even in war's darkest places. When Lieutenant Thomas Whitaker emerged from beneath the floorboards on April 12, 1945, carrying the knowledge that Roosevelt was gone, he carried also the knowledge that American voices still reached across oceans and battle lines to speak to him. The radio network he helped operate had transformed captivity from isolation into engagement, had made prisoners into witnesses and participants, had sustained hope when hope required evidence to survive. Roosevelt's death tested that hope to its limits. But the radios, those fragile collections of scavenged wire and stolen components, proved stronger than grief, connecting men behind wire to the nation they had served and would return to. In the end, the radios told them the truth they needed most, that even